Hello, and
Hello.
welcome to the December version of my treaty conversations. My name's Ruben Berg. I'm a Gunnersborough man, and it's a pleasure to be joined here this time by Auntie Muriel Bamblett. Hello, Auntie Muriel.
How you going, Ruben?
I'm going not too bad. I'm hoping I've got
That's
the
good.
technology up and running here now. But we should be streaming live on YouTube at the moment, and also should be connected across to Facebook. And so just hoping to have a really great conversation with you tonight, and hoping some people want to put forward some questions to us that we can answer about the Assembly and the treaty process more broadly. Before we dive into things too much though, of course, I want to recognise that as a Gunnersborough man, that I'm not here on my country today. I'm over in the southeastern suburbs. I was lucky enough after COVID, the restrictions lifted, to be able to go back down to Hopkins River last weekend, which was a great relief to be back down there and see family and just be back down on country. So that was really nice. But I'm here in the eastern suburbs on the lands of both the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people. So acknowledge them and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. Pay my respect to you, of course, Auntie Muriel, and to other people who might be joining us as part of this conversation today.
Yeah, thank you. I too want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. My people are obviously Yorta Yorta, Bunurong, Taungurong, Wurundjeri. I can go back and back and back. So it's a wonderful thing to have such a strong Aboriginal linkage with this land. But yeah, I'm on Wurundjeri land, so I do want to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and really appreciate the fact that we can sit here and have this conversation. And particularly with you as a young man, I knew your mother well, and I know your father much better. In the Aboriginal community, he's been such a key figure in our community. So,
thank you, I appreciate that, and it's really glad you could come along and have this chat here. So we do have a Treaty Assembly meeting coming up next week on the 7th and the 8th of December, which is going to be pretty exciting. Is that our fourth or our fifth Assembly Chamber meeting that's going to be?
I don't know. It's really hard under COVID now because the face-to-face, we've had very few, but, Zooming is a little bit different. And so it's a little bit more challenging. And I think it feels really hard. And I think, what I'm challenged with is that we can't get out really and talk to our communities and can't actually have community forums. And so we've got all these great plans around how we're going to engage and better engage with our people. But, until COVID really lifts, it's really challenging because we've got a full-on agenda to, roll out a number of, what we were elected to do, and we haven't been able to get to community. And so I think that once COVID lifts, I think community better be prepared, because we are going to have so much information going to them. We will be consulting and talking and, really on some amazing stuff. But yeah, I think it is really challenging.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges will be that we're not going to be the only ones who's going to be out there trying to engage with communities. So that's going to be a struggle, I think. And I guess just reflect back, I think it was a year ago then now, pretty much, we would have been getting ready for our first chamber meeting in a Parliament House. Yes. That feels like a world away now, to be honest.
Yeah, wasn't that an amazing occasion to be in Parliament House and walking through the aisle, and have security and all those things, and, to just have priority access. It was amazing. But, congratulations to Jill and, Vicky and Auntie Eleanor and all those that set up the day. And, it was really sort of a special day, and there was a lot of ceremony. And so, it was really important to set the scene right, and, to meet with the Premier, to meet with, the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Gavin Jennings. So it set the scene, I think, for what we would, for the baton that we were to take up around, progressing treaty.
Yeah, for sure. It was a really powerful occasion. And to think, I think there was some concerns that some people had, and I think understandably so, about having it in Parliament House. But yeah. I just think the act of the government saying, no, well, we're going to hand over this chamber for you to be able to use for your chamber, I think was a powerful symbol. And I think the right for that journey, I think that was an important thing to be able to do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm more getting into the concept of what we were there to deliver. And so the aesthetics about, you know, the building and everything like that. I mean, it never really impresses me, Parliament House and all that gold trimmings and everything like that. I think I was just looking forward to meeting all of the, you know, my fellow, you know, assembly members, and really just getting on with the work. I think, you know, and a bit nervous about the task that we've got. I think not knowing or not. I mean, how far have we progressed in 12 months? Like, how much did we know about the actual work that we were to do when we first started? And so, and how quickly have we, you know, sort of got ourselves, we've got a council now, we've got, you know, we've got working groups, and we've, you know, got engagement, we've got all these things that are happening. It's hard to sort of, you know, to get on with the business, but also to, you know, most of us are working full-time jobs, and this is, you know, something that we do, and I just love it. I've learned so much about treaty. I think anybody that thinks they know everything about treaty, wow, I think there's so many different aspects to it, really.
Yeah, it's definitely been a journey. It's a constant process of discovering new things and understanding new things, and just when you start, I feel like I start to understand something, then you just kind of unlock another part of it and go, oh my goodness, there's this whole other part that we're going to need to kind of unpack to understand.
Yeah, and you're one of the best. You know, you're very good at asking the questions and understanding. And so whenever you speak, we think, oh, Riman's going to add something really good. And so it, you know, I think that's the really great thing about that room. There are so many people that bring so much, you know, and so much depth to the conversation. And there's, you know, like people that are real policy nerds that love to get into, let's get, you know, the wording right. And so between us all, we all seem to be able to, you know, we're getting the job done.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it is that the value of having that the group of us who represent, we all represent our people, we all represent our communities, but we all have different life experience and different skills that we bring to the conversation that really will hopefully lead us to getting the best outcome from this whole process.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're lucky too that we've got a balance of two co-chairs, one a female, and, you know, an elder, and a, you know, and a young and upcoming, you know, I believe he's going to be a politician one day. But, you know, like, isn't it great when and if you look around even the assembly, you know, we are a mix of, you know, young people. We've got, you know, some of us that are not so young, and, you know, but a lot of depth and a lot of skills and a lot of passion, and, you know, everybody brings something. And the fact that we're all traditional owners as well, it's just exciting. And I think, you know, the best is yet to come. I mean, we've been given a really big challenge. I mean, we know that, you know, coming up with, you know, the treaty authority, the dispute resolution, the negotiation framework, the self-determination fund, the elder voice, and the cultural governance. And if we didn't have enough, we went out and decided we're going to establish as well a Truth and Justice Commission, and the terms, we're now looking at the terms of reference for that.
Yeah, there is a lot of things that they're on our plate, and as you say, some of those are some of the specific things we've been legislated that we need to do under that act, and then some of the additional things that we felt were kind of necessary to do the work that we need to actually do. But it is one that balance of trying to say, you know, how can we focus on what we're kind of the primary thing we've been charged with, and still recognize the importance of some of these other things, but not necessarily get distracted too much by them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've got a massive agenda, and I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, the community has charged us to take on, well, initially it was 3 things, and so we've included them, but I do think the, you know, establishing the Truth and Justice Committee is something, commission is just groundbreaking. And, you know, I think that once we get the terms of reference, once we actually, you know, begin the process, I think we can start to look at healing. And I think it's a really great opportunity to, particularly Victoria was, you know, felt the harshest of invasion, you know, more massacre sites, more, you know, the fact that, you know, language immersion has been loss of language, lost, people removed so far from communities, herded onto missions and reserves. I think, you know, those stories need to be told.
Yeah, it's an important part of the process that if we're we're going to be putting in place treaties, if the government's going to be working with us to put in place treaties, we need to understand that the grounding for why we need to have those things, and that is an important part of that process.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I mean, I think we've heard some stories. I think Peter Hood's talked about, what he wants the Truth and Justice Commission to focus on, and talked about the stories of, his family. And I think, like we've had Annie Eunice Wright and the Stolen Generations and reparations, and wanting to hear those stories. And I think they're important. My dad, was born on Lake Tyers Mission, but because he had fairer skin at 14, they said, you can go and make it in the white man's world. And, I can't even imagine, like, I've got 14-year-old grandchildren. And look at our kids, they're not living, they're still 30 and still living at home. Imagine what it would have been like for a 14-year-old. Yeah. So, those harsh policies and the removal, certainly Annie Eunice Wright's story, and, the tragedy of what happened to her, but to all stolen generations in Victoria and the removal patterns. We're still dealing with it at VACA. Many families that we see are sixth generation of having been removed.
Yeah.
And people that were brought to Victoria on the promise of, going to a holiday camp and never returned home. So, the rabbit-proof fence is proof that, Aboriginal people were taken from all remote parts of Australia and brought to Victoria as well.
Yeah, well, hopefully, what we're starting to establish through the Truth and Justice Commission there, and through the actual outcomes from treaty.
Yeah,
this is why we're doing this stuff, to try and help address some of those things.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, it's also about truth telling in the history and like education, changing, racist attitude, addressing institutionalization, racism, in systemic racism, unconscious bias, what's been raised through Black Lives Matter. I think some of the, what the Truth and Justice Commission can do will actually start to address some of those issues.
Now, I'm just seeing on our chat here, we've got the ability for people to ask us questions here this afternoon as part of our conversation. And so you can either do that on YouTube, just directly on the little chat window there. And I see that Auntie Georgina Nicholson says hello to us both there in the chat. So hello to you.
Yep.
And if people do have questions, fire away in the chat there, and we'll try and get to those. Also, if you're on Facebook there, you can just ask a question on any one of the posts I've made about the chat here today, and I'll try and get to those as we progress along. But really welcome those questions from people.
Yeah. I grew up with the Nicholson family in Hillsville, so I went to school with Alice, Georgina's sister. So the Nicholson family have been very well known and very well, doing such great things across our communities. So acknowledge them. Yeah.
Indeed. What I thought we might do is we'll just talk through what we've got coming up for our next meeting, some of the key items we've got to have discussions about and some decisions about. There's not a lot of decisions, I feel, from this next meeting we've got. There's a few, but I think, as you mentioned earlier, that COVID has kind of really limited, understandably, what we're able to do. So I think that's kind of had an impact on some of the progress we're having in some of these key areas.
I think we're still really unpacking and making sure that what we take to the community is well thought through, well planned, and really well informed. And so I think that's critical. I mean, the dispute resolution process, obviously getting an independent umpire from the beginning had to be one of the beginning points. But, like we're starting to have really good conversations about the self-determination fund. So we will see some really key decisions made out of this. But I do think that a key part, and obviously we're having our first AGM, so much to happen with our first AGM, our first annual report, and reporting on outcomes. And so it seems like we have to set up the back of house, all of our back of house, our communications and our engagement team. And so there's been a lot of work, but the Assembly have, been at a lot of the working groups. So as the Assembly's been amazing, but I was interested to see on the agenda that we've got Megan Davis again coming and talking to us. I've been on a couple of working groups where she's informed us about the technicalities. And, you know, like we've been very fortunate along the process to hear from Marsha Langton, to hear from people about, you know, important thinkings when coming up with a treaty framework. And so I think you have to draw on academics, don't you?
Yeah, I think that, you know, that's been one of the great things of knowing that as the Assembly, we can kind of reach out to some of those people and ask for their expert advice. And yeah, having Professor Megan Davis come along and talk to us has been really useful. So it would be great to have that. We're both sitting on the Treaty Negotiating Framework Committee. And some people might not.
Yeah, wasn't that an amazing when we had the international people come from Canada and then New Zealand, and so Zooming means you get them into, you know, you can ask them really good questions, and you can, you know, pose some of the most challenging questions about what happened, you know, treaties, what does it mean, you know, and ask some of the challenges for First Peoples in Canada about negotiating treaties and what, you know, and some of the challenges. So
yeah, and so it has been really useful to learn from those past experiences. But as we know, every situation is different. And so we can try and learn from what they've done right there, learn from some of their mistakes, but we're going to have to adapt what they've done to what's actually going to work for us and our communities here too, which is one of the challenges. So no matter what we're doing, it's going to be kind of new ground that we're treading in the work that we're doing, despite being able to draw from that past knowledge. You mentioned some of the work that's been done to kind of set up the business of the Assembly, and there has been, from my perspective at least, I think a big uptick in the amount of discussion and communication that's gone out there for communities. And so hopefully people have had a chance to look through. There was a discussion paper put out about the reserve seat pathways that we'll talk about in a moment, I think. And also there was the draft truth-telling in terms of reference was put out about that. There's also the new monthly newsletter that's been put out by the Assembly. So you can sign up for that at firstpeoplesvic.org. And I think that's been a good way to kind of share a monthly update of what's been happening. And it's kind of overwhelming, actually, when I look through some of those monthly updates to see all the different things that are happening around the place. There's a lot happening, as you say.
I found that I love the live streams. I sat in on many of the live streams, so I thought they were, our members, getting up and putting themselves. It's very hard to put yourself out there, isn't it? And sort of because the questions coming in, and I think the Secretariat are very good as far as making sure that they protect the members, because sometimes you get some really curly questions and some really ugly questions. So I think it's really important that we're focused. We're focused on getting treaty up. I don't know if I'll see treaty in my lifetime, but I would hope that we have that the work that we do really sets a strong foundation. And I think we're testing our brains, testing ourselves legally, around morally, around how do we actually do this. We're not just saying this is a blank check. We're going to write it and treaty will be written in the next, and people will be able to go. We're actually really looking at how do we get the most and get the best process up for our people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think when we talk about the negotiating framework, the treaty negotiating framework, it's one of those three key pillars, and we've got an item on the agenda for our chamber meeting coming up. And one of the things we've got specifically on the agenda for that, I'm just finding my right notes here, is around our kind of thoughts that we should, and I think we should, and this is my view, and I think that's important to state with lots of these conversations, that we're not speaking on behalf of everybody else in the Assembly. No. I'm just giving you my views, and I know Muriel will give your views. But the sense that we want to have as a starting point with our negotiations with government to say that everything that's within their control under the Constitution, whatever powers they have as a state, should be on the table as something that can be negotiated, as long as it doesn't reduce the outcomes that have already been achieved by traditional owners here in Victoria and other groups, and other Aboriginal organisations. So I think that's a really powerful starting point that hopefully we can endorse as an Assembly, and that will set us up to start those conversations. Because one of the challenges I think with this whole treaty process is that there is many layers to this. There's many tiers to it, and I think from an outsider perspective, it might be kind of reasonable to think that, okay, we've said we're going to have a treaty. The government says they want to have a treaty. We've got the First Peoples Assembly. Let's get a treaty. You know, let's see what's happening.
Yeah.
And you know, we're just there's been many steps before us to get to where we are here, and we're just going to be kind of moving along the ball a little bit more to hopefully get government to sit down and agree to the process for treaties, and what is on the table, what's off the table, what is already kind of understood to be allowed to be negotiated, and what does the government think is totally off the table. But yeah, from my perspective, everything they have authority over should be on the table. And that should be the starting point. Otherwise, it's not a real treaty conversation if they're already limiting the things we can talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, sovereignty was never ceded. And that is, you know, really, we, you know, live as paupers on our own land, you know, without some way of, you know, this treaty actually, you know, being based on equity, based on human rights and on, you know, the fact that, you know, like Aboriginal people don't have status in our own lands. And so I think this self-determination conversation, this treaty conversation, as you know, other states and territories are now, you know, beginning those conversations. We see that Queensland is beginning to have those conversations and Northern Territory. And so, you know, I think that we're much more advanced. We've already got our, you know, into legislation, you know, the fact that there's a treaty agreement making legislation for Victoria means that, you know, we're a step closer to it. Now it really is about us shoring up and being really strong about what does treaty making look like? How do we make sure that there's equity? And so that's where the treaty authority and the dispute resolution will come in, because we do need to have an independent umpire that, you know, works, because and the discussions we've had about the inequity in power balances, the government has all these big high-flying lawyers and, you know, and often all the statutes and things that have been built around them. And so, you know, we know that we've got to be able to challenge a lot of those legal statutes and, you know, be able to as well be able to make sure that we have this equal representation, not only in, you know, as in numbers, but also in being able to bring really good conversations, legal conversations based on rights and you know, our rights as First Peoples. And I think because, you know, the correlation between Commonwealth and state, I think those are some of the anomalies that we will be challenged with, though.
Yep, there's a lot of stuff, as you say, to kind of unpack in this process. And the thing I'm always kind of aspiring towards is getting in my mind, you know, getting myself in the position of, if I was a traditional owner, sitting down to actually negotiate the treaty. And I encourage community out there who are listening to this and who are interested in this process to think about, if you were sitting down at the table with the government, what kind of rules would you like to have in place? What steps would you like already to be agreed to make that process as easy as possible, to make sure that you are on level footing when you go to negotiate that treaty? Because that's hopefully the stuff that we can embed within this framework now, so that it can be guaranteed and locked in, so that each traditional owner group doesn't have to renegotiate that as part of their process. So what are those kind of fundamental things that we want to have embedded, so that when we are at the table, whoever it is, to negotiate treaties, or at that level playing field, and have, you know, the right processes in place?
You know, I think, Ruben, you know, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to get into every Aboriginal house, every Aboriginal home, to be able to get, you know, engage all of our people in our families. I think in Canada, the First Peoples over there made it their business to go and sit with every family in every home to talk about the treaty and begin that discussion. We're not there simply because at the moment we're not negotiating the treaty, and we won't be negotiating. We'll be setting up a framework. But when I think traditional owners do get to the stage where they start to negotiate, I think it will be important to engage every family, every Aboriginal person in Victoria, because I think that it would be hard yakka if only a few Aboriginal people are sitting at the table negotiating treaties on behalf of all Victorians.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's similar to what we talked about in the value of having the 31 of us sitting around as the assembly. The more voices we can hear from the community, the more ideas that will come up that haven't been thought of before about how to get this right. and to guide this whole process in the right direction. Yeah.
Can you answer, do you think there's a lot of knowledge about treaty out in the Aboriginal community in Victoria?
I would say there's an awareness of that treaties happening. I'd say there's some probably an amount of misunderstanding about the treaty processes out there, and I think there is a fair few people who've got kind of their heads around what the actual details of it are. But I think more importantly, I think there's people who understand what they aspire to around treaty, if not the kind of technicalities of how it's going to be achieved. I think there's many people who've thought about what it means for their future, for their children, for their children's children. And so from my view, when I'm talking about engaging with communities, and that's, as you say, something hopefully we'll be able to do more and more of in the future. And one of my hopes in that regard is to be able to actually go out to more community events and actually be present and there, and just knowing that if people do want to have those conversations, they can come and talk to us. Because I think that's very different from having a treaty specific event where only people who are interested in treaty come along to, or have the time and effort to come along to it, as compared to just being present in the community so that we can just have those kind of informal chats. But I see it as my responsibility as a member of the Assembly to kind of convert those aspirations and those broad ideas and work out how does the mechanics of what we're trying to do make that work. So I don't think it's up to all community to understand the detailed ins and outs of the treaty process, but to have aspirations and to hopefully support it. And we do need to build support within our community for the process. And so I think getting out there and being visible, being present when we can, I think will be one of the key ways to do that.
And, most states and territories would say that, the real Aboriginal people live in the Northern Territory or remote parts of Queensland and Western Australia. What do you think it could do for the Aboriginal footprint, a treaty?
In terms of raising that awareness beyond that idea? Yeah, I think it will be a powerful step towards that. I think it will be, the actual process of the state government sitting down and having negotiated treaty outcomes will hopefully raise the awareness with the broader Victorian community about the significance of us as an Aboriginal community. And especially if we can be the first ones to do it, to just demonstrate, the strength that we know that we have as Victorian Aboriginal people to get that done. But I think it might also just be the enduring legacy of what treaty achieves might help to do that too. That, one of the aspirations through treaty is improving education, and that will be one way of strengthening that in the future.
Because I think people see it as sometimes as bricks and mortar and not as, like language immersion. You think about New Zealand when they introduced language into schools. And so do you think that more people learning, traditional language? Because we know that, Hutton Street Primary School was teaching Wurrung language, and what they found was children were not only learning Aboriginal, words and songs, they were also, their NAPLAN results were improving. So, language immersion, cultural immersion has to be, a driving, force for us to be able to cement our Aboriginal footprint. There's been times where there's been lots of cultural centres, and the museum is, the Bundjalak is absolutely amazing, and, but we should have more of those. And, when tourists come out here, in Victoria, they don't go to any Aboriginal sacred sites. They don't, can treaties actually make a cultural difference?
I would hope so, and that's why I'm in it, to hope that we can make that cultural change. And I think one of the challenges is that we do have such a diverse community as an Aboriginal people that there are, multiple languages that people would need to learn. And so I think it's at that local level that I think there could be that great strengthening, and that's where I think treaty does have that opportunity, because we've agreed to approach this as a statewide and the local treaties, that hopefully treaties can help kind of cement some of the work that's going on in some local councils in particular, to better strengthen that connection and understanding. And that's one of the things that I'm always passionate to talk to people about, is how do they better understand their local places, their local communities, to understand that, as you say, the names of the creek, who are the clans from where they're living, so that there can be that direct connection. So it's not seen as just Northern Territory and Queensland, but that people do have those direct connections. And I definitely think treaty opens up the opportunities to, I think there is work being done in these areas, But to me, the great power of treaty is that we'll kind of be able to cut through some of the red tape. It would be able to just make it a key driver for making sure those things happen, not just as an optional extra, but now there's a binding agreement that we have to do those things. That's where I think the power of treaty can come in, and through that empower our peoples to continue to make decisions about that. Because that's the other thing I think that's really important about treaty, is that it's not about a one point in time having to make all the decisions right and then going to be locked in. It's about ensuring that Aboriginal peoples are always at the table to make those decisions, so that when things evolve and change, we're still there to make the next decisions about what happens after that.
I'm going to take you on a different track now.
Okay.
All right. I guess we have, a lot of young people on the First Peoples Assembly. You've got children. Have you spoken to your children about treaty? And what's that conversation like? How have they engaged in the treaty conversation?
Sure. So I've got two little kids, so a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. So
I think the 3-year-old may be a little bit out of it.
It's a bit ambitious for her. But with the 7-year-old, we talk about it in kind of more practical terms. He kind of understands the work that I do. I don't really understand all the work that I do, so it's going to be hard enough for him to understand it. But we talk about what I'm doing and what this means to have these agreements. And, we talk about things like when we went down to Framlingham the other day, about how, our families, generations before us have looked after this land. And he was talking about the forest and saying, I think it would be good if there weren't cars could drive through this part. And I said, well, you know what, we can then talk to our communities and have all of us agree on whether we think there should be cars coming in. We can make that decision. And that treaty now allows more of those decisions to be made by us. So, we're having that conversation in that regard of how can we kind of take ownership of our spaces and ownership of what happens in our lives and take control of that. So I think
do you think we don't talk to children enough? Because I think when we had NAIDOC week a few weeks ago, somebody asked me about how do you talk to kids about racism and get children to talk about, and because they learn racism from 3 upwards, and so if we're going to engage children, how do we talk to children and young people about treaty, and when should we speak to them? Because I think what you just demonstrated, it is about experiential. It's about, showing them, taking them to their traditional lands and understanding how the treaty can, envelope them in their culture and make it sort of real. And I think that's, children, I believe children need to grow up with treaty and thinking of treaty, and also we need to bring them along the journey.
Definitely. As you said, it's about that tangible connection to their everyday lives that we can try and bring it into that.
Yeah. I also, we've been able to, as well get the doing the work with elders and the role of elders. Have you got any views? You've got, a dad, I guess, that's not short on a few words. What do you reckon? How would he figure in this elder's voice? And do you think he would,
He's been pretty strong on from what I understand, of saying that, he's done a lot of his work to get where things are now, and he's very much of the view that it's up to the next generation to kind of take up the lead and work out what they want to be doing. So that's very much his.
Well, he must be very proud of you then.
Yeah, I think he's proud of the stuff that I know he's proud of.
Well, he should be.
The stuff that I'm getting to do. But it is important, that elders' voice, and that is something we've got coming up to discuss at our next chamber. More so just to say that, and I think understandably, that we need more time to have these conversations. There was an idea that we could have this elders' voice in place sooner rather than later. But I think the aim is to hold off and get it right, make sure we can talk to people in person, which we haven't been able to do, understandably. And so I think it is a good idea to kind of wait so that we can have more of those conversations to ensure that when we are bringing elders on board to be, part of the business of the Assembly, that's done respectfully and that's done the right way, and take time to do that. And that's what it takes.
And do you think that, COVID for me absolutely just heightened how important elders are, and how, when the pandemic hit, we all went into protecting our elders straight away. We did all the things to make sure, because none of us, we don't see elders just as an ageing population. We actually see them as storytellers, as, you know, lawmakers, as a whole raft of things. And to just think about losing one would be an absolute, you know, tragedy. And to think about, you know, the numbers of, you know, aged people that were lost during COVID. I just think that COVID really hit home for me. Elders, you know, are our carers for children, like they, you know, particularly in the work that I'm in, we see so many grandparents looking after their grandchildren, and we see so many elders that work in our workplaces that bring law, and, you know, we see Aboriginal men that bring a certain amount of respect, you know, all those things that elders, you know, bring to our community. I think that in the treaty making, we need to honour their place, their stories, what they've contributed, and make sure that we, you know, create a place of honour and respect for elders and what they've contributed over the generations. I think it's critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the things that it brings to my mind is the sense of, you know, that sense of urgency about the work that we're doing, of trying to move quickly but at the right speed. That, you know, we want to try and get some of these outcomes so that those elders who have worked so hard to get us in this place can see some of those outcomes actually be achieved. But we also don't want to rush things and get it, you know, just for the sake of rushing and make mistakes along the way. So it's that really tricky balance of keeping things moving, but not rushing in a way that we're going to miss out on things. But so that we can.
And I mean, I think that's the challenge, isn't it? That's the real challenge, is when you actually go to the community and go to elders and say, can you, you know, authorise this, or, you know, are we on the right track? Can you, you know, validate what we're finding and what we're doing? And so it's like, if you go too early, then, you know, it absolutely destroys the process. But at what stage? And COVID really has stopped us from doing that, because we can't go in and sit with elders. We can't have elders groups because, you know, they're the biggest risk under COVID. So some of these things are things that, you know, really are challenging us at the moment. Yeah.
We've got some questions in the chat there that I might just try and get to, which are about, there's one talking about kind of the idea of a national treaty. Someone was watching Lydia Thorpe's speech, which I got to watch some of that before we jumped on here today, which was fantastic to see her to be able to be there and giving her maiden speech. But she was talking about the idea of a national treaty, and there's also a question there around other states, in particular New South Wales. I don't know too much about what's happening with New South Wales and treaty. No,
I haven't heard anything about New South Wales at all.
Queensland, Northern Territory, South Australia had started the process, but
and then stopped.
Paused.
When this government got in, when the new government got in, they didn't take up the conversation.
Yeah, and a national treaty that's not yet on the agenda, it seems, at the moment. But, you know, I mean, I think there are different views around this whole process, and everyone's entitled to their view. But I think, whilst the Victorian government has put out this opportunity, I think we'd be foolish to not try and take this opportunity and make the most of it while we can, even if it's not a national treaty, even if it comes before a national treaty. This is the opportunity we have right now, and we should try and make the most of that opportunity, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and we've always talked about, you know, how mean-spirited and how, you know, the Commonwealth government just doesn't see, you know, the merit in it. And I guess what we're hoping to do is really prove in Victoria that, you know, a treaty can work. And it's not about, you know, you give me rights, does that take rights away from anybody else? If Aboriginal people have rights, if there's dignity and respect to us, does that make anyone else less? I think we have to honour that. You know, we go to other countries and people absolutely love to meet First Peoples of Australia, and yet in your own country you say First Peoples, and it's like, you know, often met with really sort of a lot of negativity.
Yeah, and I mean, it is one of the aims within the treaty legislation to say that treaty should bring a benefit to all Victorians, and I think it will. And I think that if we can, you know, demonstrate that will help other states and territories in the nation to say, well, this is actually a good idea. This isn't just about helping Aboriginal people. This is about benefiting the whole community as part of that process. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the majority of Victorians will be there. There'll be a minority that will be, but they're in every society. You see the hate mail, the keyboard warriors that get on and, they're very brave behind the computer, but, and spill out horrible things. And it's not just about Aboriginal, it's about, Muslims, it's about, anything that's different. And I think, not accepting diversity and not accepting, particularly, but we are the first people,
Now, one of the other things I was going to touch on was around the self-determination fund. So that is a decision we've got coming up to make around that. Have you been, so I was mentioning before, there are these different subcommittees of the Assembly that focus on particular issues. Are you on, I know you're on the...
No, I'm on 3.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are the other ones that you're on? You're on the negotiating framework that I'm also on.
The Treaty Authority, the Truth and Justice Commission, and the treaty negotiation framework.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the Self-Determination Fund Committee is doing a lot of great work, and they've put forward some ideas about the actual fund that's supposed to be there. This is one of the 3 key pillars of the work that the Assembly needs to do, is a way of ensuring there's funds to support communities in the treaty process that aren't tied to government, that we can actually control that as an Aboriginal community about how those funds operate. So there's been a variety of ways that could be discussed, and we're going to hear more about that on Monday or Tuesday. Can't remember which day. I think it's on Monday.
Yeah.
And I think importantly, there's some really key kind of drivers behind those decisions, which are around that sense of self-determination, around ensuring fairness and equity, consistent, having some good governance principles behind that, but also ensuring there's sustainability and stability in how that fund operates. So I think that'll be a good conversation, and hopefully we can get a good outcome there in terms of how we're going to start to progress.
It's always a challenge. It's always a challenge when dollars go on the table to come up with equity, and so I think that's going to be the challenges. Most traditional owners and most people in the treaty process want to know that we've done everything to make sure that there's equity across all traditional owner groups and those or any of those that are negotiating treaties.
Yeah, and that transparency as part of that, I think, is going to be really important. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can't actually start negotiating that self-determination fund matters until we've resolved the dispute resolution process, which from my understanding, we're going to get an update on. We're progressing. So last meeting, we did authorise the negotiators to kind of finalise that dispute resolution. So hopefully there's some positive progress being made there. Have you got any updates in particular around that item? Do you know?
No, I think that, a lot of it was really around trying to make sure that if there was a dispute about, we're very much in a Western construct of, how systems deal with, disputes. And so trying to make sure that we, as much as possible, because, there's legislation, there's policies, we've been really sort of being really clear about how do we get the most fairest process. We were looking at jurisprudence where greater control by Aboriginal people to be able to make decisions, and so equity around. And so I think coming up at this stage, we really do need to have an independent umpire that's totally independent from government, and that will, we'd love an umpire that sees Aboriginal first and foremost and make sure that we're looked after, but it's got to be equitable. Obviously, the state government needs to, we need to reassure everybody that, there's equity at the table, that's all.
Yeah, and I think from what I understand, the aim is to have majority of Aboriginal voices involved in that process, regardless of whether they're appointed by the state or appointed by the Assembly as part of that authority. So I think that's a really important element of it. I think that's also one of the challenges, though, actually moving forward in this treaty space, that I never kind of see it as this sense of the government against the Aboriginal community, and I know that's a perception that has from the past understandably come about from many communities. But as someone who works a lot with government, I have various government roles. I see there's great opportunities to kind of partner with government and better understand their perspectives so that we can get better outcomes. And so having Aboriginal people within government, I think assists us, as long as we're always mindful that our ultimate goal is our broader community. But yeah, I think there's definitely
Well, I think
value in
that,
being able to tap into
yeah,
that.
and that was really sort of significant when the Victorian government actually included the treaty working group in the drafting of the legislation. I think it didn't become, we're going to draft legislation for you, about you, not and without you. So they actually, we were part of the drafting group, and so it was really, really, from our point of view, we had to really make sure that the language was tight enough to really hold government account, because you only have to put in a word like may instead of will, and all of a sudden it's a way out. And so being sure, and even when we're looking at this dispute resolution, we've gone through it word by word to make sure that the language is as tight as possible, and that there's no way for people to get out of what the dispute is about, and creating equity and the ability to be able to make sure that the resolution process is really fair and equitable.
But I think you've touched on one of the key challenges I think we come across through this process, that we often talk about wanting to make it as culturally appropriate as possible and reflect our culture within these things. But there's also a balance between, we actually need to make sure we can keep the government accountable to those things. And if we can't describe it in a way that from a legal perspective is going to bind them, I think we kind of lose out if we're only focusing on trying to get it from that cultural perspective. I think we need both. I think we need to ensure that we've got a way that we can understand it from a cultural perspective, but unless it's written in a way that will be binding for government, it's not going to have any teeth. So I think we're going to have to find a way of compromising those two things.
Yeah, and I think
that's not compromising them, but for bringing those two things together.
That's why I think that's been a great thing about having Megan Davis in the room, because she talks about the different types of law, and and making sure that there's constitutional law, and then there's all the legal framework, and they're very based in a Westminster system, so they've been adapted, and it's never been adapted for treaty making, and so there's been no sort of framework in Australia, or any legal structures and dispute resolution, or even if we went to the highest court, with Eddie Mabo, he had to go through the highest court in order to get equity. And so how will, if he had to do it at that level, how Aboriginal people will we need to keep going through the high courts when when there's when we can't or the negotiations break down? And I think this is some of the real challenges of this process.
Yeah, well, hopefully the kind of principles that are embedded within the dispute resolution process, the principles within the authority, and I mean, I also think though that the actual legislation already has some really powerful principles embedded within it. Like, as you said, there was a lot of great work to ensure that those perspectives are already included in that. So government has already made a lot of commitments down this path. And so, it would be strange and unusual for them to kind of try and sneak out of that, but we still need to make sure that they don't have a way to do that necessarily.
Yeah, and we've got also the cultural governance group. Are you on that one?
I'm not on that one. I received the papers for that one, but I don't.
Yeah. So I mean that clearly, I think sets the parameters for us to set up our cultural protocols, and the way that we will work and respect and build on the Aboriginal principles of relationships. And I think that I'll be really keen to look at the feedback from that. So yeah, I haven't read that paper yet. See the big stack of papers I got to read.
There's a lot of papers we need to read, everybody. And feel free, if those listening out there, to fire in the questions. We'll try and answer those as those come up. But you mentioned the Cultural Governance Committee, and one of the things they've also been working on is around the additional recognition pathways for being represented on the Assembly, because we have at the moment the 21 of us who are elected, you and myself included, from the Metro region. And then there are the seats for the registered Aboriginal parties that get nominated by their groups to have a seat at the table. And we're trying to work out what are the ways that we can ensure that all the traditional owners here in Victoria are represented through some form of recognition as a designated representative of their community. And I think unsurprisingly, that's quite a challenge. And so we're going to continue to have those conversations. And that's another one of those things that COVID has made quite tough to get an outcome to. So we'll continue those conversations. But I must say, from my perspective, I'm open to seeing ways that we can do it, but I'm not convinced that we'll be able to find a way to better reflect, to include all the groups that want to be included, given that, you know, we already have a group like the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council, who that's like almost their primary role is to make those decisions. And for better or worse, I know that not everyone agrees with how they do things, but as you know, my dad was on there for quite some time, so I have a lot of respect for the work that they do. There's a reason why they haven't been able to appoint registered Aboriginal parties across the whole state. Like, if it was easier to do, it would have been done. So there is a lot of challenges there, and I don't know that we're necessarily equipped to be able to be better placed to solve some of those things than they are. So I'm open to suggestions of how we could do it, but I'm not confident we'll find ways of doing it that are going to make everyone happy.
I think you've given a great response. Did you want to touch on, I mean, I think the question that people ask me all the time is, what about Aboriginal people that live in Victoria, lived here all their life but weren't born here? How will the treaty impact on them? So I think people ask that question all the time. So how do you think, you know, what can we say to people that, you know, have lived here all their lives, their grandparents lived here, but they're not traditional owners?
Yeah, well, I think the treaty is definitely for them as well. I mean, it's been clear in the legislation that treaty is for traditional owners and for Aboriginal Victorians. And so if you're Aboriginal and you live in Victoria, that to me, you're an Aboriginal Victorian. And the way that we've kind of put forward this idea of having a statewide treaty and having localized treaties, I would think that the localized treaties are going to be more for the benefit of the nations or the clans or the groups, however they want to organize themselves. And I think that the statewide treaty will be able to deliver those benefits for everybody. So I think that's where the benefits will come for those who aren't necessarily traditional owners here.
Can you give us some examples of how do you think?
Sure. I mean, well, the statewide treaty could deal with things like education, of ensuring that there's better access to education for Aboriginal people, and that will include not traditional owners. But it will also ensure that there's better outcomes for everyone in education to better understand our cultures, better understand our communities, so that, you know, as an Aboriginal person engaging with society, you're going to be engaging with people that are better informed, and that's going to support.
Because it's interesting, Ruben, because I work in child protection, and a number of the children we work with, their families don't come from Victoria. We're not. The child protection, really, the majority of children we're working with don't come from Victoria. So what does that say about, you know, our families in Victoria? We know 80% of our families are doing really well, 20% aren't. So, you know, it is about understanding that we're setting up a treaty framework that covers all people that are, you know, our Aboriginal people that are poor and disadvantaged and don't get good access to good services, and which is their right. I mean, I think the treaty will need to address things like racism. It will need to address, you know, institutional racism, systemic racism, and, you know, block it out. I'm a football yobbo. I love going to watch my Essendon team, but for years it was culturally unsafe. I loved Derek Kickett running around on the football oval, and, you know, I heard such terrible abuse hurled at. If any of our Aboriginal players played really well, the fans called them every sort of name. Now, you know, it's really safe to go to football. I want Victoria to be safe for all Aboriginal kids growing up, for us to be able to walk with pride. I mean, I do walk with pride as an individual, but I just think, you know, for our kids to say they're Aboriginal at school is to face, you know, the question about, oh, you're black this and you're black that. Yeah. You know, I want our children to be proud to say they're Aboriginal, to wear the Aboriginal flag, to, you know, be able to be champions, to be warriors, to fight the, you know, fight of Aboriginal kids.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say to all those out there who are not traditional owners but living here in Victoria as an Aboriginal person, reach out to us as Assembly members. You know, your voice is important as well.
Yeah.
We want to hear from you about those things, and we want to make sure that your interests are covered, bearing in mind, of course, that we're just developing the framework, but that's part of the ongoing conversation.
We're the middleman. We're the middleman at the moment.
There's a question here from...
We're the doofus, aren't we?
We're the which?
The doofus. We're going to do all the work. I
thought you were calling me a doofus, but that's all right.
I don't mean the Gubba doofer word. I mean the Aboriginal. We're the workers. We're working on getting all this done.
We are. There's a question here from Mick Harding. Hi, Mick. How are you? He has got a question around: will we have a statewide community meeting in the new year? I think what we're post-COVID.
Yeah.
I think what we're probably more likely to have before a whole statewide meeting is the regional meetings. I think hopefully we'll have those in the not too distant future in the new year, because we do have the different regions for the Assembly, and I think having that regional approach is, I think, a good way to kind of have those conversations. So I would hope that in the first half of the year, at the very least, we're going to have much larger conversations at that regional level. Whether that filters into a larger statewide one, I'm not sure, but I would definitely be keen to make sure that we have a regional level, so a metro region community gathering to have those conversations, but not just one, but many, many, many of those. But also, as I said, for us to be reaching out and being engaged with other events that are happening so that people can have those conversations who might not otherwise have the chance.
Good question.
Yeah, there's two other things I just want to quickly touch on before we wrap up in a moment. So keep your questions coming in if you've got any more out there. One of the things to just touch on was that we'll be looking at the Truth and Justice terms of reference. So those are up online that people can have a look through those, and we'll be having a further conversation around those at the Assembly, and hopefully getting a sense of what the broad community feedback has been around that and the other consultation that's taking place. So that will be interesting to continue those conversations. And the other conversation is one around the 26th of January and just seeing what is our view as an Assembly on that matter of having the 26th of January as Australia Day. And I think it's because it's a national holiday, I assume it's more controlled by the Commonwealth, but I think the state has a role to play in that. And we're going to have a conversation around what we want to do as an Assembly around that, whether it is to say we're going to have a major campaign around it, or we're just going to say, you know, on the date, we recognise that this is not a date for celebration. It could also be around ensuring that as part of the framework for treaty for what's on the table, that a conversation around the 26th of January should be something that's on the table as part of those conversations. So that's the other thing we'll be touching on. Anything about those things you wanted to touch on any more further on, Muriel?
I guess because we tend to be, you know, growing the list, I always think, oh my goodness, if we keep, you know, we've got so much to focus on, I guess. You know, we get asked to comment on a lot of things. We get asked to comment on, you know, the bushfires, on, you know, the tree, you know, issue within, you know, Gunditjmering, and you know, I just, yeah, I guess wanting to be really let people know that we are doing the work. We aren't becoming the voice, and we aren't becoming the, you know, representative of all issues to do with Aboriginal.
I agree, 100%.
Yeah, and so I hope that when, you know, when we do, after we get the treaty, that we do, you know, have the capacity to have some form of self-governing, that Aboriginal people can, you know, form parts of government and be able to, you know, inform key decisions. I think at this stage we are able to really influence government decisions. We are, you know, we've got obviously politicians in there, but they still have to serve the party lines. So, you know, thinking about our own, you know, New Zealand had their own form of governance, and you know, the treaty is informing all parts of government. It isn't just a treaty that's written; it's actually it informs all government's interactions with, you know, the Maori community. So, thinking about how do we make sure that we stay focused on the priorities that we were elected to do, but, you know, don't get too involved in becoming the voice or seen as the voice for the Aboriginal community.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I don't think we should be running any sort of campaign around it. I'd like to see us, just on the day, say we acknowledge what this day is, and this is what it means to us. And to make sure it's still on the agenda as part of the conversation. I think that's what I'll be pursuing as part of that. And if other people out there have different views, that's what we want to hear from you. So I think as an Assembly, we want to hear from people. This is not the only way. This is just one quick way to give everyone a bit of an update here this evening about what's been happening. But really encourage you to reach out to your Assembly members. Online, you can jump on board and find out everyone's contact details, and you can send us all messages. I've got lots of Facebook and Twitter stuff, and Muriel, I know you love Facebook. You're always on there and doing stuff.
No, I've only got 25 friends. 25
on Facebook. Beyond that, you've got many, many more. But
okay, thank you.
People can jump on board at firstpeoplesvic.org to find out all our contact details. You can still enroll to vote. So we need more people to be signing up to enroll. We're not going to have the elections for a little while now, but the more people we have on there, the more people we can demonstrate are buying into this process, the stronger position we're going to have in Assembly to continue to progress these things. So encourage people to do that. Don't hesitate to reach out, to contact us, to ask questions, and hold us accountable, because that's what we're here to do, to be able to answer those things and try and get the best outcomes we can on this treaty path, so that we can get a process locked in, so that, soon we can actually start the actual treaty process to get those outcomes and embed that.
You sound like you would make a good politician one day, Ruben.
I'll stick to doing this at the moment. Thank you very much. Anything else? Any last comments you wanted to make there, Muriel?
Oh, no, I just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me on. I think, I think none of us are experts around that, Treaty Assembly, but together we're a pretty good team, and we've been working really hard. None of us, when we entered this room, had, a lot of knowledge of each other, and I think that we're focused on the work, and I think we're working very hard to deliver for our people in Victoria: a treaty making framework, a self-determination fund, a Truth and Justice Commission, a treaty authority, those things that are important to us. And so I'm pleased to be a part of it, and I'm only a small part of it. I think that other people do a lot more lifting. I acknowledge, both Marcus Stewart and Geraldine Atkinson and all of the council for their leadership and the work that they do. And I was disappointed when you jumped off, but, you have to make decisions. But we'll also be looking at a replacement for you in the future. So still quite a challenge. Our constitution's a bit hard to read, but we'll get there. But thank you very much for inviting me along today to talk to you.
Thank you so much for joining me, Muriel Bamblett. Thanks for everyone who's been watching and following along. And as I said, feel free to always ask us more questions. Always happy to answer.